All right, so this PowerPoint presentation is on Aristotelian logic and how to use that logic to actually fashion an argument. Um, this picture here is of Aristotle, Greek philosopher, and he devised a system of logical thinking that is known as deduction. And this deductive system uses a model known as a syllogism. So why are we learning this stuff? What's the point? Well, first off, you have to understand that when you go off to college, that every single one of your classes will expect you to use sound logic in all of the projects that you do. And those projects include written essays and research papers. They also include presentations. So reasoning is really, really important. And as such, this is the basis of academic thought. So all universities, all colleges are founded on the principle that logic is the necessary glue that holds all ideas together. Now, the way you demonstrate this logic is by making obvious or explicit connections between all of your major thoughts. And if you make these connections, what it allows someone to do is it allows them to follow your train of thought. If someone can start at point A and follow along all the way point B, point C, all the way through, then you're most likely using logic because they are able to follow through. Now, Aristotle worked with this very specific method of demonstrating logic, which he called syllogisms. And syllogisms are a formal system of thought. What that means is there's a form, an actual structure that you are to follow every time you use a syllogism. Now, a syllogism actually provides a method to connect those major ideas together, to go from one to the next to the next. If you use a syllogism, deductively, someone will be able to travel through your major ideas and follow along with you. So let's talk about syllogisms. First off, let me just give you an example of one so you see what these things look like. Wood floats in water. Ships are made of wood, therefore ships float in water. You can see this is very simplistic, but notice the first premise, wood floats in water, followed by ships are made of wood, forces your mind to reach the conclusion, therefore ships float in water. And this syllogism, although simplistic, is exactly the structure of logic that you need to understand in order to help you write better. So again, if we break apart the components of what we just looked at, number one and number two were the premise, number three is called the conclusion. And so again, premise one, wood floats in water. Premise two, ships are made of wood. And then finally the conclusion, therefore ships float in water. Notice if you accept premise one and then you accept premise two, your mind has to reach the conclusion. Now, let's practice this. Premise one, if all humans are mortal and all Greeks are humans, can you feel the force of the logic moving you towards the conclusion? If all humans are mortal and all Greeks are humans, then all Greeks are mortal. Notice how it is essentially combining terms from the second and first premise in order to reach the conclusion, the terms being Greek and mortal. So now, understand that this does not mean that all deductive logic is perfectly constructed. Not at all. Or not constructed, but that it's sound. Not at all. So let me give an example of how this gets funky or funny. We can say, first premise, all chickens have two legs. Aristotle has two legs. Therefore, Aristotle is a chicken. So you can see this is clearly flawed. It's ridiculous. But it does take that deductive syllogistic structure. But there's an issue here, and I won't get to the issue just yet. I want us to be able to evaluate a syllogism like this and understand the issue upcoming. So we'll get there. Now, first off, you have to understand when you're writing an essay and you are trying to use logic in order to build to a point, to really support a point that you've already established in your thesis, you need to watch what your premises are actually doing. What are your premises saying? Because those premises need to follow one from the other until you reach a valid conclusion. Now, let's practice this by filling in the missing component. So, all trees have root systems. There's a blank. Therefore, all trees need nitrogen. So, which component is missing? Premise 1, premise 2, or the conclusion? Premise 2 is missing. So, since we know premise 2 is missing, can you figure out what it is? This is a bit like algebra. Since there's a missing component, you can call it x, right? Like in algebra. You can figure out x based on the other components that are there. There it is. All root systems need nitrogen. So to follow along from beginning to end, all trees have root systems. All root systems need nitrogen. Therefore, all trees need nitrogen. You can see how the force of the logic follows from one premise to the next and leads you to the conclusion. Let's try again. All fruits grow on trees. Therefore, all oranges grow on trees. What's missing? Premise number 1. All oranges are fruits. So again, from beginning to end, all oranges are fruits, and all fruits grow on trees. Therefore, all oranges grow on trees. Now, you might want to say to yourself, well, wait a minute. Not all fruit grows on trees. A tomato is technically a fruit. Tomato grows on vines, or a bush. So there are potential issues here based on the accuracy of the premises that you use, but notice the structure still exists, right? So the premises can be false or not completely true, but the structure is what leads one's mind to the conclusion. That's the important point. If you understand the structure, you have a better chance of bringing someone along with you in your writing and in your speech. How about this one? All bachelors are single. Johnny is single. As you can see, the conclusion's missing here, right? So what's the conclusion? Can you figure it out? Hence, Johnny is a bachelor. You can see, again, the force of the logic leading you to that conclusion. Now, I want to show you what this looks like without the syllogism format, and I realize that my camera window is now over some of the slides, so I'll try to read it to you. And it sounds like this. Every day I go to work. This journey from my home to my office takes 1 hour. My office starts at 8 o'clock in the morning. So, if I leave my home at 7 o'clock in the morning, I will reach the office in time. So you can see the way that the logic is built, you arrive at the conclusion intellectually, comprehendingly, just as the paragraph finishes. That's the point. You follow along from beginning to end. The word so here is important, by the way. This is a signal word. It signals that you're reaching a conclusion. So the words like so or therefore, in conclusion, right? Those are an obvious phrase. Those are going to point to you and say, hey, logically, guess what? Everything that came before this, we're now going to apply to reach a conclusion. So let's talk about two really important components to argument, and that is the component of validity, the validity of an argument, and an argument's soundness. This is a huge definition. I understand that, but take a look. Validity is when a deductive argument takes the form that makes it impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. As long as it takes that form, if the form is there, that's what matters. Where the premises are true and the conclusion therefore can't be false, it's valid. Now, if that form does not apply, we call that deductive argument invalid. This is the trick. This is where everyone gets stuck. When trying to determine validity, valid arguments don't require true premises. The premises don't have to be true for the conclusion to be valid. In other words, when a conclusion is said to be valid, all you're saying is, I can reach this conclusion if I grant the two premises that are above it. So I'll give you an example. So here's an example of a valid argument that actually has true premises. Either Elizabeth owns a Honda or she owns a Saturn. Elizabeth does not own a Honda, therefore Elizabeth owns a Saturn. So the point of a valid argument here, or trying to evaluate the validity here as a valid argument, is that you can reach the conclusion that Elizabeth owns a Saturn if we accept the two premises above it. If we accept. So regardless whether the first premise, either Elizabeth owns a Honda or she owns a Saturn, is true. What if she owns a Dodge or something? That is immaterial. Don't worry about truth or falsity. The only thing we have to be concerned with is look at that conclusion. Given that conclusion, given the premises, can we reach that conclusion? And the answer here is absolutely yes. We can reach the conclusion given the premises. Truth or falsity don't matter. Here's another one. Now here's a valid argument with false premises. I love this one. All toasters are items made of gold. All items made of gold are time travel devices. Therefore, all toasters are time travel devices. Now you're probably thinking, wait, what? This is ridiculous. And it is. It's insane. This is supposed to be silly, but I wanted to use a silly example just to point to you the way in which validity does not require all the premises to be true, but it's still a valid argument here. Take a look. If we simply accept premise 1 and premise number 2, can we reach the conclusion? The answer is yes. Yes, we can. If all toasters are items made of gold, and all items made of gold are time travel devices, then the structure says we certainly can say all toasters are time travel devices. We can get to that conclusion given those premises. That's a valid argument. Now, the issue that you should be having when you say, wait a minute, this is valid? That's weird. As you consider this, is that there's another term I said we're going to be learning, and that term is soundness. This argument is horribly unsound. It's not sound at all, but it is valid. You can certainly reach that conclusion given the premises. But the problem is the premises are false. That's going to affect soundness. We'll get to that. So here it is. A sound argument then is one that is not only valid, in other words, you can reach the conclusion given the premises, but those premises are actually true. So let's talk about this. Another way to word this, to think about it, is that a deductive argument is sound if and only if it's valid, number one, and number two, all of its premises are actually true. So as long as both criteria, validity and true premises, are being met, it's valid. Otherwise, if one of those two are not met, the argument is automatically unsound. It's unsound. In fact, what's really interesting about this is when you're evaluating arguments, evaluating syllogisms, trying to figure out if a syllogism is valid, then if it's sound, notice how the definition for soundness requires validity. It requires a valid conclusion. That's the first criteria for soundness. So given that, if you are evaluating a syllogism, trying to evaluate the logic of it, and you find, hey, I cannot get to this conclusion given those premises. It's an invalid conclusion. When you're trying to determine soundness, you can stop right there. You don't have to worry about whether the premises are true, because look at the definition of soundness. Soundness requires validity, and since it requires validity, then who cares about the premises? If it's already an invalid argument, you cannot reach that conclusion given the premises, then ignore the premises altogether. It's already unsound, automatically unsound. So if an argument is invalid, it is automatically unsound. It's one of the worst arguments you can make. It's an invalid, therefore unsound argument. So let's look at examples of soundness here. So here's a sound argument. No felons are eligible voters. Some professional athletes are felons, therefore some professional athletes are not eligible voters. Now I realize there's some wonkiness here because something like, 8 or 7 years ago, the state of Florida actually changed it so that felons can vote in the state of Florida. But let's just imagine a world where uniformly across the United States, felons had their voting rights taken from them, as many do. So if that's the case, if felons are not eligible to vote, then premise number one would be true. Now, let me back up quickly here. If we're looking for validity first, that's the first criteria is validity. Well, can you reach the conclusion given those premises? Right? Can you say some professional athletes are not eligible to vote? Can you say that? Is that valid to say, given the idea that no felons are eligible voters and some professional athletes, well, they are in fact felons? We hear about these stories all the time in the news, don't we? Where athletes mess up. So given those two premises, can we reach that conclusion? The answer is yeah, absolutely we can. So it's valid. We can get to the conclusion. Good. Well, now, if you go back to the definition of soundness, soundness says, well, it's valid, number one, but number two, the premises are actually true. So look at those premises. No felons are eligible voters. And again, we're pretending for the moment here that that's true across the United States. So we'll say that's true. And then the second premise reads, some professional athletes are felons. Well, we know that to be true. Michael Vick was an example, right? And there's professional athletes who were charged with murder and all sorts of things. So we know there's two premises are true. Valid conclusion, true premises. That makes this sound. This is a sound argument. Let's take another look. Oh, by the way, here's quantifiers. These words, these terms are really, really important when trying to evaluate someone's logic. If someone says the word all or none or never, you could usually attack those quantifiers because if you find even one case to the contrary of what they say, because what they have said is an absolute, right? You say, never has this ever happened. As an example, and it never has the United States had to suffer a pandemic like this. Well, never? Really? That's curious because in 1918 we had the Spanish flu, right? So you come up with one single example to refute what someone says or writes if they use quantifiers like this. You have to be careful with these quantifiers.